Right, good morning everybody. Welcome to the Finance and Audit Committee meeting of the 21st of October. First of all, I'll take apologies, and we have apologies from Councillor Petrinos and Councillor Rutherford. Are there any?
For early departure.
Okay, that's early departure for Councillor Finlay. Are there any other apologies? So I will move that the apologies be accepted. Thank you, Councillor Hapeta, for seconding. And we'll go to vote. And that is carried unanimously. I would just like to explain that this meeting is being recorded and that it will be on the Council's website. The meeting is also being live streamed on the Council's YouTube channel. Health and safety. The health and safety procedures are on the screen in front of you, and just please note all the exits. Report anything to administrators in front here. I think I've covered off that. There is no councillors in remotely today, so that is all. So we'll now move on to any notice of additional items. I have none. So I'll move on to item number 3, which is declarations of interest. There being none. And we'll now move on to item number 4, which is public comment. So Richard, if you would like to come down. Richard is the Campus Operations Manager for Massey University, and he'll be speaking to item number 8. So you have 3 minutes when you're ready, Richard.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, everybody. Madam Chair, councillors, as noted, ko Richard Tukawingoa, Campus Operations Manager for the Massey Manawatu campus. This morning is an opportunity just to acknowledge those who have contributed over the last few years to a successful installation of a turf at Massey University. It's been highlighted by a partnership approach across the council, the university, as well as Hockey Manawatu. I have a colleague who was unable to be here today. Here's our Sport Advancement Manager, Jacob Oram, who's still in lockdown after a quarantine in relation to his cricket commitments. So I just wanted to highlight some operational highlights over the last few months since the inception of the turf. So the turf was opened on Thursday, June 25th with a traditional Māori blessing. And since the first three months of operation, the Massey turf has had a number of different age groups, schools, clubs and representative teams using the turf. Perhaps a highlight has been the Lower North Island Secondary Schools Premier Tournament from August the 31st to September the 4th. This saw the city host secondary schools from around the country and at the Twin Turfs and the Massey turf. Second marquee event was the bespoke tertiary sports invitational tournament at the turfs. So I think that's really all I wanted to say. We wanted to thank the university, Hockey Manawatu, on behalf of those groups, wanted to thank the council for your support for that, for this turf and the opportunities it gives young people and older people like myself who still play. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. We appreciate your comments. Councillors, are there any questions? There being none? Oh no, we have one. The Mayor, now where's he? Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, just over here. Kia ora, thanks very much for your report there, or presentation. Install, has everything gone 100% with the install?
There were some delays due to COVID factors, so some of the turf was laying in containers for a couple of months. which caused some concern in terms of laying, but everything, as far as we're aware, has been rectified, and we have assurances that should it not play as well as it is expected to, a full relay would take place over the summer, so that's still to be ascertained.
So it has got a sort of a warranty on it?
Yes, it has, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
In terms of playing as well, so we were given the all clear to play, and should it not play as it should do, a full replacement has been guaranteed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you, Richard. There's no further questions. I will now move for the public comment. Do I have the seconder? Thank you, Councillor Hapeta, and you can vote. And that is carried unanimously. We now move on to item number 5, which is confirmation of the minutes. Would anyone like to move the minutes? Thank you, Councillor Naylor. Seconder. Thank you, Councillor Dennison. Are there any comments for the minutes? No, that's straightforward. So we'll move to vote. And that is carried unanimously. We now move on to item number 6, which is on page 11, and that is the airport, Palmerston North Airport Limited, and we have David Lanham and Steve to present.
Good morning, Madam Chair, Councillors. You'll all know David Lanham, the Chief Executive from the airport company. He's going to make some very brief comments following up on the report, and also to just give us a very brief outline of the circumstances as they find themselves in today, just so that since we considered the statement of intent a couple of months back and asked for a bit of an update, so that's what he's going to do just for a couple of moments as part of today. The day's report, as you will take as read really, but just reinforce that it's just reporting on the performance up to the end of June last year. It's recommending some resolutions in relation to the annual meeting, which is taken in writing for the company. And from my perspective, it's a really significant year for the airport in that it was heading to perform, I suppose, well above expectations and what we had in the original budgets. COVID struck. The company, from my observation, performed exceptionally well to react to that and to place themselves in a position where they didn't need to come to the council for support, unlike a number of other entities around the country. So for that, I think we should be grateful. And so David then would like to make a moment or two in terms of a comment.
Sure. Tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, Madam Chair, Mayor Smith, councillors. As Steve's saying, I'll be brief in terms of the 1920 year. Obviously, you've seen the annual report. I'll talk a little bit more about the current year, though, once I'm through the 1920 year. So revenue result of 9.1 million was about 2 million behind SOI, and really the majority of that occurred in that final quarter with the lockdowns across country significantly impacting on our passenger volumes. So we achieved something like 50,000 passengers in that final 4 months, where typically we'd achieve something like 200,000. So a very rapid, swift impact on our business. We were lucky that we were tracking ahead on costs throughout the year, and we managed to pull back even further in the last few months once we were aware of what was happening. But we are largely a fixed cost business, and so very tricky to pull cost out at short notice. We also noticed something like a 60% decline in cash flow, operating cash flow in that final quarter, which was a big driver of decisions around the year that we're currently in. The result of 1.6 million in terms of net profit after tax didn't seem as bad, 18% below SOI and 40% behind last year, but it was looking not good in that final quarter. I was very, very happy with the team, the way they responded to the situation. It's not nice being in an airport that's closed. It's not nice being in lockdown and having the team working from home and also facing a restructure, but my team came through all of those challenges very, very well, and I acknowledge them today. Despite the setbacks, we did achieve some other milestones during the year, including continued progress with our carbon management program. We continued our community support, including Flypalmi Arena, Wild Base, Just Silch, Festivals of Culture, and our special partners at Te Rangi Marae Marae. A key learning from the year really is that we do need to progress with diversification of revenue. You're aware that is a key strategic pillar of ours, to invest in Ruapehu Business Park to really mitigate against aeronautical cycles. Just touching now on the current year. We last met with you in June, I think it was. At that stage, we had presented an SOI of 265,000 passengers for the year. You'll recall last year we made, or the year before rather, we generated something like 680,000 or 690,000 passengers. So it was a significant downward spiral for us. At that meeting, I did flag a fast recovery with passenger volumes closer to 400,000. We believe that is still very achievable. It has been pleasing to see Air New Zealand's confidence in adding back flights, notwithstanding the loss, of course, of Hamilton and Wellington. They have been very bullish on Christchurch and Auckland, and as you'll be aware, just this week we had Origin Air launch Hamilton Palmerston North flights. So all of those factors give us a little bit of confidence that the 400,000 mark can be achieved. Still well down though, of course, on pre-COVID numbers of that 680 to 700,000. As a result of that level of passenger volume, we think we can achieve about 8.2 million in revenue, up on the 6.2 million in the SOI, but down on original SOI from February, which was about 10.8 million. That translates, we think, through to a net profit after tax result of about 1.3 million instead of a loss of about 600,000. But, you know, I hasten to add, there remains significant uncertainty, as we all know. Business sentiment, airline confidence, community transmission, if it happens again, government response, these are critical factors. And we know from what happened in that final quarter of the year, the impact can be very swift, and a $2 million turnaround that we're predicting could easily be taken away if we had a similar lockdown event that we did March to June. As a result, we have to be very, very cautious in what we're spending on. We continue to look for cost savings around non-essential items. We have trimmed back, as you would have heard in June, our CapEx to 4.7 million. That is bare bones, essential CapEx only, primarily airside, pavement rejuvenation, etc. Seismic upgrade of the terminal, new air conditioning units that were at end of life. But non-essential activity, primarily landside, has had to stop. We simply have to preserve our cash. Looking further ahead, it is very difficult. It's difficult to look at this current year, but going 2-3 years out is even more tricky. We are again seeing glimmers of hope, but really our best estimate is that maybe by year 3 of what was this 3-year SOI period, we might be at 570,000 passengers. So that's the sort of level of passengers we had 5 years ago, but still very, very tricky to know what's around the corner. That's really all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And we now have questions. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, David, and appreciate everything that's going on in that turbulent world of air travel. But great to see Origin Air adding some services. I suppose working with what we've got and what you can control and around customer experience, got a couple of questions. Just the terminal maintenance, you spoke about the air conditioning. Can I ask when the the escalator will get fixed?
So there's a range of in-terminal pieces of infrastructure that were really hinging on the terminal development plan. So as you recall, that was the $15 million upgrade of the terminal, which would have included a relocation of the escalator. I'm not sure exactly of the cost to fix it, but it's in the hundreds of thousands, I understand. It was going to be part of the TDP, so we've had to put that on hold and prioritise other areas as mentioned.
So, just if I could tease that out, Madam Chair. So essentially, that will stay like that for the next 3 years until the terminal gets done?
I guess it depends on how quickly the recovery happens and what CapEx we have available and where we can prioritise. I mean, we are very conscious of our role as a regional gateway. You're all aware of, you know, the efforts we've been to in terms of the arrival experience and within the terminal in the arrivals area. We're not happy with the state of that escalator. We're not happy with the forecourt or the loop road. But unfortunately at this moment we just don't have the cash to do those things properly.
So just two more questions, Madam Chair. So just teasing that out even further. So what's the, you know, again, customer experience, and you probably know where I'm going with this, the large fence that's been developed around the entranceway and the scrapping of the drop-off and pick-up zones. Is that adding to customer experience?
No, it's not, but that is not, that's a trial. What we're doing at the moment, we've taken the opportunity with the low passenger volumes to trial some passenger flow ideas, concepts. We have a concept plan of how the terminal frontage and forecourt will look. It won't be like it currently is, but we're trialling some passenger movement ideas. We did have a significant health and safety issue with those 4 car parks outside the terminal. They were only for drop-off, not for pickup. Pickup has always been in the general car park. We want to make that experience for pickup and drop-off best in class, and ultimately that's where we'll get to. At the moment, we're trialling some things.
So why are we doing it to different to other airports, including Auckland?
The concept of a commercial lane, if you like, against the terminal is exactly the same as some other airports like Hawke's Bay. We believe we need more space for our public to pick up and drop off, and we can't achieve that along the front. The best option is parallel parking within that front row of the general car park with pods of cover, so people will be able to get out of their car and be semi-protected from the weather.
But you've got a large fence in front of there, which means if you park at different parts, you're going to get wet. You're channeling them all through one little gate.
Ultimately, there'll be 3 crossing points. Again, we're just trialling something with low volumes. We could have left it the way it was, but we did have a health and safety risk. We do want to trial it and see what works and what doesn't. But certainly the ultimate concept is in line with other regional airports.
And just finally, Madam Chair, have parking charges been increased since COVID?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just following on that questioning, when you say parking charges haven't been increased, my understanding is last time I was at the airport you had 30 minutes free time.
No, that's not correct.
It's always been
Madam Chair.
15 minutes?
It's always been 15. We have the P30 car parks along the front of the general car park, so you may be being confused with that.
Okay, thank
but
you.
It's been 15 before my time.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, David. My question is regarding your comments about carbon management. Is there any comparison with the other airports in country of the same size and some of the international airports? Where do we stand regarding your carbon management plan or position?
Thanks for that question, Councillor. There are 2 regional airports in New Zealand that have adopted the Airport Council International Carbon Accreditation Program, that being ourselves and Hawke's Bay. And it was very pleasing to read that the New Zealand Airports Association is recommending that other regional airports follow that same program going forward. So in terms of being able to compare ourselves with other airports on the ACA program, that's really only Hawke's Bay at the moment. They're trying to achieve level 1 accreditation, I believe, whereas we're on to level 2 accreditation.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Are there any further questions? Yep, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for the report. And certainly I understand and agree with the need to manage cash carefully. Just in relation to your capital spend, what's the implication or downside of delaying strategic capital investment? Can you just outline what the risks and costs that are?
A key driver of the CapEx that remains is compliance. So we have a runway end overlay programmed to kick off shortly. So essentially the driver in these tough times is compliance. Seismic within the terminal, that is addressing a low level of rating at one end of the terminal. Air conditioning's end of life, so we risk it failing over the summer months. But those are some of the drivers.
That's the CapEx that we're not committing to.
Beg your pardon?
That is the capital expenditure that you're not committing to.
No, that's examples of CapEx that we are
So
committing to.
my question is more around the conscious decision not to invest strategically in non-urgent, non-immediate CapEx. What's the downside and the cost to the business of making that decision?
A lot of the CapEx related to Ruapehu Business Park and the extent of commercialisation of that area. By not doing it, obviously puts us back a year in terms of the next construction window. We are trying to move ahead with a modest investment within the commercial precinct, but essentially it does put us back at least a year in terms of the commercial developments.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. There are no further questions, David and Steve, so you may step down. I am happy to move the recommendations. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Naylor. Now open for comment. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As most will know, I'm always very pro the airport for the important role they play, and I think it is important. It's a gateway for the city, and in some ways affects the city's reputation and profile. So customer experience is really, really important. And I must admit, like most New Zealanders, I haven't flown much recently, but I did over the last couple of weeks with just different events that I needed to be at. And I was somewhat, I'd say customer experience, I didn't have a good customer experience with getting to the airport. Having to be channelled through what I'd call a sheep race was not great. And I understand they're doing some trials. I just hope to the airport management and board that it isn't permanent, because I just felt it was very average. So please, if we can get that parking and entranceway right, and I know there's a bigger plan, and I know it's linked to capital, and I think Mr. Armstrong's questions around what are the risks to the business by not doing some of this capital work, i.e. what are we doing with the escalator, all of those sound quite small things, but actually they're bigger things. Well, they add up to a bigger thing around the customer experience. If you look at regional New Zealand, Nelson, New Plymouth, Hawke's Bay, Invercargill have all done quite big upgrades to their regional airports. I know we are scheduled to do one, but the risk we run, if we don't move on some of this stuff, we fall behind. So we have a city and a region that's going off economically, going well, and our airport is part of that. So I do encourage the management and the board to keep the foot on the pedal in terms of that maintenance around the terminal, certainly sort out the parking, and hopefully improve customer experience. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. And just picking up on the response to Councillor Butt's question, really very heartening to hear that what started here in Palmerston North around carbon accreditation with the airport is now being taken up by another airport and now is being recommended by the association. I think a nice example of being the leading regional airport in New Zealand. So I'd thank the airport for taking that on board early, and glad to hear that there's a pack forming up around that, and hopefully we'll stay at the front of that pack over time.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I did just want to commend the airport for getting through COVID and presenting a positive balance sheet, because I think we shouldn't underestimate the level of challenge to an airport in the COVID crisis. And if I can remind you, councillors, we were all a little bit in fear and trepidation, wondering if the airport would be coming to us asking for money. And so to find that you know, they've got through successfully with the balance sheet still in good order, and are predicting again to be able to get through the next year with, again, when things are quite uncertain, I think needs to be commended. And I just want to say thank you very much for doing that. I understand that there have to be tough decisions about what can be done and what can't be done in such a situation. But I think from us and from the ratepayers of Palmerston North, we're very grateful that you haven't needed a handout, so thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. And finally, I'd just like to make a comment. I too had a not a very good customer experience last week, where I had to drop off and pick up somebody. I won't go into the detail, but I think I'm pleased to see that this is a trial. But however, I don't want to overshadow what has been a fantastic result over this period, as Councillor Johnson has said, and to get those passenger numbers up towards that 400,000 plus again, I mean, is quite significant. And the fact that the council hasn't had to dip into its finances for bailouts, I think that's definitely significant. So I congratulate you for a job well done, so thank you. So we will now vote. And that is carried unanimously. Now, councillors, I'm just moving item number 8 ahead of item number 7, just as Mr. Lloyd is here, so that he doesn't have to sit through our financials for time. So if you go to item number 8, which is on page 125 of the agenda. And Kathy, yes, thank you. Kathy is presenting. And item under number 8 is Massey University Hockey Turf, or my words today, agreement for shared use. So over to you, Kathy.
Thank you, councillors. I'll take the report as read, and I just ask that Aaron join me at the table to help answer any questions you may have on the report. Yes,
certainly. So, Aaron. So are there any questions, councillors? Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the report. It's just probably a mistake on page 128 and 129 says different portions of the renewal costs of the 3 partners. It is adding up to 110%. Is it intentional margin, 10%, or?
It's interesting, before we came to present this report, we said that may cause some confusion. What the intent is that the steering group will attempt to raise 10% of the funding cost for the renewal. The balance of costs will then be split 70-30 between the university and the council. So that is after the 10% has been taken off. So in effect, we're going to be splitting 90% of the costs. Oh yes, and and 10% was coming from the user charges as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Dennison.
My question, thank you, Madam Chair, was in relationship to the appointment option of a councillor. The most related body that I can recall is the athletics track, where we have a councillor on the body. I just want to weigh up the need, really, of having somebody appointed, and is there any other examples to promote that it would be have significant value?
I think you're right. I think that probably is the only other example, is the athletics one. It's really from a governance point of view versus a management point of view. So whether councillors were of the mind to entrust those governance matters, given that they are really about operating a function, to the officers, or whether they wanted to give consideration to that as a member. So it really is a choice matter, I believe. Anything that would affect the ongoing finance or governance that was of significance to council would come back to council anyway. However, in the past, it has been common for a portfolio holder to be involved in such committees or such steering groups.
Happy with that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. There are no further questions. So we'll move to the recommendations, which are in front of you. Somebody like to move the recommendations? Thank you.
Madam Chair, we need to amend number 3, either to recommend or not to recommend a councillor appointment.
Yes. So, Councillor Meehan, would you like to amend? Would you like to make an appointment or not? Okay. So item number 3 will be amended. So I'll just get the right wording. Councillor Meehan is moving that. And do we have a seconder? And then I'll alter it. And that is to put a councillor on the committee. So do we have a seconder for that? Okay, Councillor Hancock. Okay. And we're just altering that to not appoint a councillor. The recommendation, I'll just clarify with Councillor Meehan, is not to appoint a councillor. Would you like to speak?
No, Madam Chair, I'd support appointing a councillor.
Oh, sorry, my misunderstanding. I thought you had said, so, yes. So
Sorry.
Would you like to speak to that?
Only the point that I think, in line with the athletics track, as we've done in the past, I think it would be appropriate to have a councillor.
Yes, Councillor Hancock seconded. Thank you, Councillor. So I think that's straightforward. So everybody understand the recommendations? Sorry to misunderstand you, Councillor Meehan. So are there any comments? So this is straightforward, so we'll go to the vote. And that is carried unanimously. Sorry, Councillor Barrett, you came in after. So we will now move back to item number 7, which is the quarterly report, which is on page 59. So we have the CFO, Stuart McKinnon, presenting the report, and Andrew.
Morning all.
So ready when you are, gentlemen.
Thank you. Present to you a quarterly report to the end of September 2020. I will largely leave the report as is, make a couple of brief comments. One is both revenue and expenditure from an operating perspective are above budget and above expectation. This resulted in a net controllable surplus of $368,000. The main driver for that increased revenue and expenditure is in an increased level of building and planning activity that we hadn't really anticipated. Without rates and interest, which help of course,
The natural surplus is about $137,000. And I guess I just want to repeat the message from the CEO that this is a difficult budget for us to live within. Significant cuts to operating expenditure in a draft budget from last year were made in coming up with this year's budget, but no corresponding expectation of a reduction in the level of service came with it. As officers, we're working extremely hard to live within our means, but this is stretching our capacity. And it's something we're very mindful of and something we're working very hard to live within. But I thought it was fair to say this is not an easy year for us to live within our budget. I guess from a capital expenditure perspective, we've delivered a total of $14.1 million of capital expenditure during the quarter. Some programs are experiencing slight delays, but at this stage we appear to be on track. That was all I had. And that's us, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll open for questions. So up first is Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Stuart and Andrew, for the report. I have got some questions, and they're around the comments in the Chief Executive's report. So, I mean, I'll address them to you, but if the Chief Executive would rather answer them, make that choice. Do we have adequate resource in Council to provide the levels of service that we've committed to at the moment?
Excuse me. At this time, and I pointed out in my report, we're carrying 61 vacancies in this organisation. I will point out that not all of them are budgeted for, but are a response to the increased levels in demand. I don't believe, not all of those are full-time roles, but if you took some of those and you actually filled them, you would see the result that might have on our budget. I would say at this stage, I do not believe we have the resources internally to keep our current levels of service, no.
Thank you. So, given that, what is the likely consequences to the annual plan, to staff welfare and to service delivery for the community if we continue on as we are?
At this stage, we're going through a workforce planning exercise. Myself, the Chief Financial Officer and the Chief People and Performance Officer, and working with the rest of the ELT to look at our forward projections in terms of our work plan for the year, looking at our resources and requests and trying to match those. But there may well need to be reductions in the level of service in order to meet our current budget.
So I'm particularly concerned about the way in which our constraints might constrain growth in the city. So particularly, say, in terms of the building inspection and the planning and that type of thing. Do you think that that's a risk?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Stuart, for the report. Also, I've got a couple of questions that arise out of the Chief Executive's report, so I'm not sure who should answer those. But just firstly, the second paragraph down on page 61 in that report, there's a comment that talks about that unplanned expenditure is surfacing, and I'm just wondering in what areas that unplanned expenditure is surfacing.
Some of that is in areas of renewal. For instance, when we start work on a project, I'll use as an example the arena, and once you get into that project, you're coming up against, once you basically take the walls off, you're coming up against all sorts of other things that need to be done, whether they be rotting, I don't know, bits of wall or I've lost for words at the moment, but pieces like that you might find, or pipes or whatever within that, and you don't know what you don't know until you get into some of these projects, and that is what we are seeing.
Okay, and thanks for that. And the further down on that same page, the second paragraph under the financial, there's also talk about focusing my attention on expenditure across the organisation to identify the changes we need to make to deliver within the budget. And I'm just interested to understand what sort of changes that you're referring to in that comment.
As per my comment before, in terms of the vacancies that we have or the requests that we have for replacements of staff, so it is, can we afford to bring those on? If we can't, what does that mean to our levels of service? What does that mean to some of the work that we are doing internally that we have been used to been doing, whether it's promotion of activities, etc. So we are looking at everything across the whole organisation to see what we can do to stay within those levels. What I didn't answer before was about, which was, if I can revert, Madam Chair, back to Councillor Johnson, who asked about the wellbeing and stress of staff. If you ask me one thing that keeps me awake at night, that is it.
Thank you. I do have a couple of further questions, if that's all right. There's been a couple of pieces of work recently, one being the regional spatial plan and also the council's new branding. I've got a couple of questions around those pieces of work. One is, were those identified through our annual budget process? And if so, where's the cost of those included in our budgets?
In terms of the branding and cost, my understanding is that we're paying for that internally with staff time. There's no specific costs that I'm aware of in the current year that add significant expenditure. I'm just looking at Sasha to confirm that my belief is correct.
So I couldn't quite hear.
Turn your microphone on, please.
You probably just need to hold it closer to your mouth.
Yeah.
Attached to what, sorry? Thank you. And is there an answer for the spatial plan piece of work in terms of whether that's been identified through our our planning process?
Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so the regional spatial planning work has been funded through existing budgets.
So just further to
and
that...
can I just, sorry, just on that, and I think we answered this question last time, but this is a cost that is divided between all councils, so our contribution to this is based on per head of population. The cost for it was reasonably small in our contribution to that, which has been going on for some time, majority of which was pre this budget. So the costs within these budgets are minimal. And much of the identity work was also done pre this current budget.
Okay, thank you. And just one further question related to the information that came out in the press release when our new branding was released, that there was a comment made that there was $55,000 worth of saving in the, I'm presuming in the artwork or graphic sort of side of things in our budget as a result of that work. And I'm just wondering what our overall costs are around that. If 55,000 seemed like a lot to be saving, so I wondered what the overall costs were in that area.
Basically, what we've done is, we've calculated how much time was spent in terms of resource outsourcing design work for the existing methodology around our identity and what we were doing. So we had over about, I think there's in excess of 60 identities and logos attached to council, and the time to develop those, maintain those, was calculated based on our
Thank you very much.
Mr Armstrong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had several questions about resource planning and staffing, which I think have been largely addressed through Councillor Johnson and Councillor Naylor's questions. I guess the one thing that I'm still slightly unclear on, having heard the response, is exactly what is the time frame and the plan forward to resolve the tension that you're facing with budget and service delivery. So would you care just to outline that a little more?
Well, I can start, and maybe the Chief Executive can fill in any blanks. But the workforce planning, the work around planning, how we react to what we see as a risk to budgets has already started. So as of right now, that workforce planning exercise is happening, where we are evaluating the need to replace staff and where they're replaced and how they're replaced. So from a time frame perspective, in terms of what that might mean from a service level perspective, I would say that's imminent. There will potentially be positions that we've been asked to fill that we might not agree to fill, and that will have service level implications, and that is imminent. And perhaps I'll leave the Chief Executive to talk about the welfare.
Yes, we certainly will have a clear understanding by certainly within a month, but we are also making decisions on a weekly basis in terms of bringing people on if we need to, and we're prioritising those around health, safety and well-being being the first priority, and the second being workloads in particular areas.
Okay, so within a month there'll be clarity. Another question I had in relation to resourcing and planning was professional services costs are $1 million over budget to the point. What's the background? What are we spending the money on? Why is securing professional services the most economically efficient outcome?
So I can answer that. That over expenditure is almost entirely related to the processing of building and resource consents, and that's been an area where we've traditionally really struggled to attract staff to work, and so we tend to contract that out to professional firms.
Yeah, not only is it a difficult area to attract staff, this is a nationwide issue. This is not just an issue pertaining to Palmerston North. We are also losing staff to central government agencies like Kāinga Ora, and that is of particular concern to a number of councils across New Zealand.
Thank you. And my last question, which is probably a question for the CFO, is I note that there's a $15 million liability on the face of the balance sheet in relation to interest rate swaps. And my question is, how is that arriving on the balance sheet? Are we hedge accounting, or are we taking it directly to profit? And how much of that $15 million liability relates to mark-to-market movements in the current fiscal year or financial year?
Yep, good questions. So, you know, that liability arises through, as you'll probably be well aware, through the timing of fixed loan arrangements and swap type agreements. And as the interest rates drop as rapidly as they have, clearly we get caught out with the opportunity cost of being locked into some of those agreements, when perhaps going at market rate might get you a cheaper price now, and therefore within the balance sheet you recognise a liability for that opportunity cost effectively. I don't know the exact number for this year. I'm just didn't see.
For this financial year?
For this financial year.
And that's accounted for directly to profit or through a reserve?
No, it's directly through profit. However, the way we present it to this committee is to put it below the line. So we present what we describe as controllable activities, and it's one of the financial movements below the
No, thank you.
line.
Thanks for that clarification. Thank you.
Mr Mayor.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. And I think Mr Armstrong's probably teased out a couple of the questions, probably just to the CE. I think, you've probably already answered this, but I'll ask it again, just around the building, you know, no matter what money we have, skilled staff are hard to find, aren't they? I mean, we're finding that with the building services.
Through you, Madam Chair, yes, they are. I mean, in normal circumstances, skilled staff are always in demand, as you can imagine, but this is a particularly difficult time. There are areas where we are taking advantage in that we are an attractive city to come to, and so we are experiencing in some areas a keenness of people to relocate to this region. It is just simply the affordability of a lot of people, and also in the building consent area and building regulatory services. This is a nationwide shortage.
Thank you.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I did have questions, as many have already, about the vacancies we're holding, but I think that's been well traversed. My other question area was around the challenges we're facing in external funding, and I wondered if there was a comment from either the CFO or CEO on noting that's obviously more challenging than we expected it to be, and what are the ongoing implications or risks for council there?
Yeah, good question, and I can only, I guess, agree with your questioning in that it is more difficult to externally fundraise than it had been pre-COVID. There are some programs, I guess, at risk because we had a third-party funding requirement before we committed to those programs. A couple, like the Splash Pad, for example, and the Bunnythorpe Hall, where fundraising was required before we started the project, and they are at risk should we not be able to find the funding. We continue to do everything we can to do so. We have had some success with some small funding, so it's not a complete disaster zone, but yet definitely more difficult than it had been traditionally.
And just to follow up on the comment made under external funding was about the Provincial Growth Fund release. So in the new government climate, are we expecting a similar commitment for government funding? Is there any early indication there about how Provincial Growth Fund, which has obviously been hugely oversubscribed, that's what I took from your comments, how that gap in funding for local councils might be addressed in future?
I think we will wait and see what is going to happen in that area, but certainly pre-election this government made a commitment to support regions and regional growth, so we, like everybody else, will keenly await the outcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I have a couple of questions. Page 72, around the arena cost overruns are anticipated. I heard the CEO mentioned that as well. So it's got cost overruns are anticipated associated with significant unexpected repairs. So when is that going to hit our budgets? And what sort of significant money are we talking about?
So we haven't seen the cost yet in terms of what you're looking at today, and Bryce may speak to this, the Chief Executive alluded to it earlier. When we ripped off some panels on walls, we discovered some significant problems, and they are being rectified. But I don't know whether Bryce has something he wants to add.
structural
So, what sort of dollars are we talking? Is this work being undertaken at the moment, or is it?
Yes, so the call was made to me. We had to literally deal with these issues. It was a health and safety issue, and in order for the arena to continue to be occupied, we had to undertake the work. I expect it will probably be about $400,000 over our renewal budget by the time we're all done in both projects.
Okay, thank you. That's answered my question. So back to you, Stuart. There's no mention in this report of 400K.
That's because the cost hasn't turned up yet. We have put the warning in that this is coming. The 400K is an estimate at this stage. We don't actually have a strong view on what that means, and we also need to look forward at the other projects within that arena to see if there's some capacity to absorb some of that additional cost. And so until we kind of have all our facts established, we haven't been able to put anything in the report for now other than to flag that there's a significant cost issue coming up.
Okay, I'll comment on that later. Thank you. Just looking on page 68, some of the unders and overs, when we look at some of the budgets, you're looking at 30% variances. And I just wondered, what are we doing to mitigate the issues around not, I suppose, forecasting some of these projects correctly? So if you go down, just to be a bit clearer, if you go sort of over budget on schedule, you've got actuals there of 947K and the budget was 463.
Yep.
And you've got 12 projects.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the comment I make on that is that phasing is done at the beginning of the year as a best estimate of how we might perform against these projects.
Yep.
And we're not necessarily giving, so we lock that in place, I guess, from a reporting perspective, so that there's some certainty for council and some certainty for us to do some measurement against expected performance. The team is delivering the capital works as best they see fit, and sometimes things can happen earlier and sometimes things can happen later, and we're not necessarily reforecasting that every month, because I guess we've drawn a line in the sand and said this is our expectation on performance for the year. And so you will see unders and overs as things appear, and perhaps we bought, I don't know the specifics of the questions you're asking project by project, but perhaps you buy a large chunk of equipment early, which doesn't leave you very far through the schedule, but from a cost perspective.
Yeah, no, I understand the process.
So,
my main concern is with our budget being sort of close to only about 238K overall, that if we have significant over budgets.
From an operating perspective, I guess, to give you some assurity that we're looking at it consistently, there's a forecasting exercise that we're doing internally at the moment to have a look at operating expenditure to the year out to figure out, basically people's best view of what the performance looks like between now and the end of June. So that's an exercise that we're undertaking internally. It's really, I guess, for my satisfaction, that there's no significant surprises there, because we have to manage within these budgets. We haven't asked for the same in the capital perspective. I think we feel capital's largely a bit better under control and has less risk, I guess, from our perspective in terms of delivery.
Okay, thank you. And my last question is around the Whakaronga Resource and Subdivision consents. That is still not come through yet, so can we have some certainty around when this is happening?
Pleased to say that as of Monday this week, we have both Horizons consent and City Council consent.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, thank you. That's a good answer to my question. Councillor Finlay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to go back a little bit to this arena. Arena 2, can I just get clarification, please, that there's a problem in the roof, that it's rusted through to a state that it's endangering health and safety. My question is, why has it got to that stage without being found? Do we not do regularly safety checks?
So there's a couple of reasons. Part of it is through a lack of condition data understanding that we've had historically. So we're making some, and I've talked to the chamber previously around some of the changes we're making to definitely improve how we do that. But historically, yes, there has been a poor understanding of the condition of our assets. In this case specifically, it's not actually visual, so there is actually the ceiling was in place, and it wasn't actually until we'd taken off those panels to go and do this project that we've actually uncovered the fact that those beams are beginning to fail. And those kind of items, I think is before you don't know what you don't know. And whenever we're doing anything in any of our sort of aging buildings, there is an increased risk that this kind of stuff pops up. That we don't know until we actually open up the wall or the ceiling, and then we identify something.
Well, my next question then, following on from that, is with our past experience, namely the Lido, when this sort of thing has happened, have we not learnt from that and check our buildings more regularly?
As I said just previously, we are undertaking quite a robust condition assessment exercise, so we are getting a much better handle and a much more reactive and live understanding of the conditions of our buildings, and that will help to be informing some of the work.
So
my overarching comment would be a historical underinvestment in this space.
So, from what you're saying, can I presume that our buildings are now checked regularly for hidden faults?
We've just gone through the entire property portfolio, and we've done an initial baseline condition assessment of every single building in our portfolio, and then we are putting some things in place to be getting a lot more live data and feeding it through continuously, so we can continue to make educated decisions.
So I presume this would be the last time we'd hear something like this coming to council. Thank you.
That's been answered. Thank you, Bryce. Are there any further questions, councillors? There are none. So we will go to the recommendations, or recommendation. And I am happy to move the report, and seconded by Councillor Naylor. And I'd just like to make a comment that overall in the financial situation and with the COVID and everything, I think we're tracking on fairly well. I do have some, I suppose, reservations around some of the budgets, especially as we're only coming to terms now with some of the conditions of our assets, and I am a bit worried when I hear 400K for arena that we haven't, and that will not be in the budgets. So we're going to have to be fairly tight in the future on how we manage our assets. Excuse me, can you just keep your voices down in the corner? Thank you. Yes, so, and in the past, we've had a poor understanding of the condition of our assets, as was noted, but I am confident with the team that we've now got in place and the restructuring that we are getting our head around the management of our assets. But I think with the nature of buildings, people have to understand, as the CEO said, that if you take something off a wall, like I found with my bathroom the other week, you can get a surprise. And so your budget's now gone from 1,000 to 5. And that's only small in the scheme of things. So I just think we need to be realistic about that. But overall, I'm happy with the report, but I am just flagging that with only 238K between balancing this budget, we're in a tight space. So I'll now hand over to the Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, I think you've summed it up well. Being tight is the appropriate word here. And with COVID in mind, I think overall it's I'd like to acknowledge the CE and the office's management. It's a really satisfactory result. Look, and I don't want to relitigate annual plan decisions. We made a majority decision to tighten our belts here, like every other business, organisation and household has. It's tough, and we're experiencing some of those things, and I know the CE and the officers are working extremely hard to try and plug those gaps. And I wouldn't expect it any different with the budgets that we've set. You know, vacancies for skilled staff are really, really hard to fill. I don't think if we had any amount of money, well, not certainly more money, we would be able to attract more and more people. It is tough to get skilled people. Levels of service are hard to maintain. We've got creaking infrastructure. We heard just properties an example, and maybe that's a bit of legacy stuff. But also roading, we're experiencing, you know, we're taking a lot of the state highway traffic within our city, and we're not getting recompensed for it. So consequently, the city has to carry the heavy lifting. I just want to comment on the external funding, because remember, we did not as a city get anything out of the PGF. Some others did, and certainly some external organisations like KiwiRail did, and it happens to land in our city, but as a city we got zero. So we need to acknowledge that. So it means it's tough, and it's tougher out there now. But I do want to commend the staff. They pulled in 170,000 in this quarter. You know, it's around events, cultural events, money towards our splash pad, which is great at Memorial Park. But I think the big thing is that the staff do have some mitigation and plans. You know, we've got a workforce plan around staffing, and I think that's great. We've got an advocacy plan with central government so that the city gets its fair share of government investment. And we've got, you know, a set of new MPs, and we'll be leveraging them as much as we can. And other external partners, whether it be businesses, trusts, other community organisations. We also have an external funding and attraction plan. Even in difficult circumstances, we've got to make sure we get other money in the door. So I think it's also been signalling internally within the organisation and externally on expectations. You know, there simply is no more money. We need to accept that. We need to live within our means. And it doesn't hurt to belt tighten, really, because everybody else, and prioritise because everyone else is. We have some real challenges coming up in the LTP, like every other council in New Zealand, and actually every other business that's budgeting at the moment. Balancing the budgets, managing debt is really tough. We're in the middle of what I'd call once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, but also government reforms. We're going to see that around Three Waters. Now that may actually be quite positive for us as well. So being prudent, along with changing some spending behaviours as well, and allowing headroom for the future, I think is really prudent. So thank you to the staff for managing us through another quarter. I suspect we're going to be going through this with the other quarters, but that's not necessarily a bad thing either. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Councillors, I think that we have received a really clear warning in this report that our budget for this year is inadequate and that there are significant risks that are presented as a result of this. I think if we take off our rose-tinted spectacles, we will find that we are at risk of slowing down the growth in the city because we are not providing adequate resourcing. And I have to say I'm not surprised. I'm not at all surprised. But at a time when the city is experiencing huge growth, I think it's highly unwise that we are limiting what we can do as a council because we haven't given staff enough money to work with. Retention of staff is an issue because people are being offered better paying conditions elsewhere. And let's make no mistake about it, that's going to continue because if we're holding 61 vacancies now, how many more are we going to be holding by the end of the year? Every vacancy, as you'll know if you've worked in an organisation where there has been a hire freeze, every vacancy creates pressure on the other members of staff in that department. It affects their well-being. And I think, councillors, we shouldn't ignore the well-being and stress of staff. We basically signed off, as the Mayor said, by a majority on an inadequate operating budget, and now we are starting to see the consequences of that. I don't believe that any kind of workplace planning exercise is suddenly going to provide a magic solution to an inadequate budget. The consequence will be loss of levels of service and a slowing down of growth in the city if we're not able to be processing building consents and planning consents at the rate that we should. I do think that it's easy to just say, oh, tighten your belts, oh, everybody's doing it. But we have a responsibility to be the enablers in the city. If we've got a city that's growing at the rate that it is, then we need to be facilitating that growth, not being the handbrake. So I'm very concerned to see this report. I think we should take this as a serious warning that things are not going well. And despite the fact that at the moment the KPIs are being met and all the rest of it, I think there's a very serious risk as we go through this year. And I don't believe that talking it up makes it actually any better.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Once again, a very good report with good quality information, so thanks for that. There's a couple of things I'd just like to quickly comment on. I asked some questions in the question time around the costs of the regional spatial plan and the new branding, and I'd like to make some comments on that in regard to our process. I'd just like to make it clear that my comments aren't related to the quality of those pieces of work in any way. I think when we go through our annual budget process, there's business as usual, which is funded through existing budgets, and anything additional to that should be identified and should be able to be prioritised by elected members. We need to be able to own and take responsibility for the decisions that are made here at Council, and where there's a lack of visibility of programs, it's really hard to take responsibility of that. And I'm sure I'm probably not the only elected member that's been asked by people in the community about why we're spending 50k on our branding at this point or other things. And certainly the costings around the regional spatial plan, I don't believe were identified clearly in our budgets either. It's, particularly, I just recognise that some of, the work around the identity did start in a previous financial year. However, the principles that I'm suggesting here in terms of our process are important no matter what the financial constraints are. I think it's important that programs are identified that are over and above business as usual or current level of service, and I think these pieces of work that I've identified do fit into that category. I'm comfortable with the decisions this council's made around our current budget, and certainly my recollection is that we didn't cut any growth programs. We also added $4 million to our expenses. So in my view, I believe it should be possible to deliver on the plan, and whilst I do acknowledge that there will be some challenges there, and we've heard about some of those today. I guess I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To echo comments, thank you for a good and clear report. I wanted to highlight particularly how useful I find the summary reporting on the Catalyst project. I think that really helps us to keep our eye on those really significant growth projects for the city that we identified through the long-term plan, and we're pushing on with, sometimes in the face of difficult external conditions. I think from the questioning around the table and the CFO's comments particularly outlining the internal difficulties that the organisation's facing, living within the budgetary constraints that, yes, we set. I think I've taken that as an indication that we'll look to see that messaging continue to come through in quarterly reporting, as it should. We need to see where the shoe is pinching, because there is no doubt that it will pinch. My concern is the external environment implications for our budget, the things that we can't control, and some of those messages have come through really clearly, and that will inevitably flow through to the LTP. We've been quite bold, I think, in some of our direction of seeking external funding for what are core projects for growth in the city. And if that environment is changing, then we need to be aware of that going into our LTP and be prepared to look at some things maybe through a different lens as that happens. So thank you for the report. I'm interested to see how some of these conversations continue as a quarterly reporting function, so that through the year we keep an eye on those difficult budget areas, the difficulties that we're going to face, and I'm sure we'll continue to face in that vacancy space. That is a real concern, and I think Councillor Johnson's comments on wellbeing are significant and should be noted around the table. So thank you for that, and we'll see where this takes us.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Finlay.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. We've got a very tight budget this year, and we're trying to keep our belt tightened as tight as we possibly can. But we must learn from past experiences. And when we find out we have a $400,000 expenditure coming up because of health and safety, because we hadn't checked on something, that concerns me, and it concerns me greatly, for the mere fact that it happened to us at the Lido, and now we've got it here at Arena, almost the same thing. Moisture on metal causes rust, and if we don't do anything about it, it gets really dangerous. But it was reassuring to hear from the staff that all other facilities similar to this in our council have been checked and are okay. So that is encouraging to know that it won't come back again. But I do think we need to learn by our mistakes. And if we don't, it's going to get worse as we go.
Thank you, Councillor. As the mover, I'll just make one final comment. Around the building and planning and consent staff, there has never been any direction from councillors to reduce that staff or not increase it. Ever since I have been on council, we have always had problems with recruitment of these type of staff, and now with the government being involved with Kaingora and wanting their own consents, that's even caused more pressure on us. So there is definitely no intention for us to be cutting back that staff, and I would expect a full report to come to council if there was any additional budgets required for that. I'm the mover, so I'm sorry, Councillor Dennison. So we'll now move. We will now vote. Carried, 13 votes for and 1 against. We will now move on to item number 9, which is on page 161, the audit arrangements for small council-controlled organisations. And that is presented by Steve.
Madam Chair, councillors, this is a relatively small issue in a sense, but one that's been dragging on a bit, and part of that's my fault, but we're trying to find a way through here to address the issue that's before us, and that is whether or not we require these two trusts, the Acacia Birch one and the Performing Arts Trust, to have an annual audit, or have something a little bit less, or have nothing at all. This report just outlines the history of what's happened over the last couple of years in terms of council resolutions. To date, we haven't amended the trust deeds for either of those entities, but my suggestions to you are shown in the report, and they're slightly different for each of them. And I'm conscious of the fact that at the moment you are undertaking other work with Keisha Birch as well. And so in terms of the timing of some of these things, if there were to be a change to the trust deed for the Keisha Birch Trust, it's not necessary that that happen in the next few months, but it would need to happen before the end of June to make sure that we were capable of handling whatever type of audit approach was required for the end of this current financial year. So we do have a little bit of time in order to line everything up if we needed to in the case of that. In the case of the Performing Arts Trust, that is administered by council staff within the organisation, and the way I see it, it's not absolutely necessary for us to have an external audit of that, and we could move to dispensing with that if the council felt that that was appropriate. So I've left in the resolution choices for you in relation to the Keisha Birch one, but a recommendation suggesting that we remove the audit requirement from the Performing Arts Trust.
Thank you, Steve. I'm now open for questions. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Steve. You've actually answered, I think, the questions that I had, which were about the two processes that we're in. But I just want to clarify what you said there around that final comment in your report about it needing to be in place for effective for the 2021 year. So to clarify, I think what I heard you said is what we actually need is any arrangement, any change to be in place for the end of the financial year.
Before the end of the financial year, because we have to engage an auditor if that's required to undertake the audit for the year that we're in.
Yeah.
And we need to have that clear as to whether we're going to do that or not.
So it's appropriate to work through this process within the financial year that it will affect. Okay,
yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Armstrong.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you, Steve. I'm assuming that the reason this is coming forward is to save cost and time. So my questions are, what is the difference? How much money and time are we saving? So what's the difference? What is it costing us to audit these entities? What's the difference in cost between an audit and a review? And why does a review give you the necessary confidence if you feel that's required? And just then more broadly, if we choose to remove the requirement for an audit or a review from both entities, what are the factors in the control environment that give you confidence that we can move forward confidently without that layer of protection?
From my perspective, the sums of money that are involved are relatively small in the big scheme of things, but they seem big to the individual entities. And so, in one sense, the part of the reason we haven't spent a lot of time on it is because in the big scheme of things, there have been other things that have ended up being more important in a sense in terms of the amount of effort and time that's required to do it. I think we all want an assurance if there's an independent entity that that we can be confident that it's what's being said is fair and that there are reasonable controls in place. In the case of the Performing Arts Trust, it is a very, very small entity with no staff, and so I don't see that there's any risks really. And there are a number of staff within the council who are involved in the process of operating that particular one from a financial perspective. So, the council does actually manage a couple of other trusts that are not audited, and so I don't see that as being too different for that one. In the case of Keisha Birch, I see that slightly differently. It is running a small but significant part of the council's operation. Whilst there are trustees there running it, they, with the small staff that they have, need to be able to get some confidence, external review of what's going on from a control point of view. So it is important that there be some, whilst that arrangement is in place, they need to have some ability to be able to draw on an external review of some sort to satisfy themselves that what they're being presented with has had someone else looking at it. So the minimum, in my view, for them is a review, and whether a full audit's required or not, not so sure. And the council itself, the Acacia Birch Trust is a subsidiary of the council, and so the council's auditors are required to satisfy themselves as well about what they're being presented for that, in terms of it being consolidated into the council's books. So if there weren't to be a review or an audit of that entity as it stands at the moment, then the council's auditors would need to undertake a little bit more work to satisfy themselves that what they're being presented with for consolidation was appropriate. But I think, as I said, I don't know that I've forgotten the amounts of money off the top of my head, but they're not. It's less than $2,000. It's about $2,000, I think, for the Performing Arts Trusts, and it's somewhere between $7,000 and $10,000 for Acacia Birch, I think, for the current audits.
Thank you.
It's a significant proportion of Acacia Birch's costs in terms of their turnover. Acacia Birch is a pretty small enterprise. Don't want to be completely contrary to Steve, but wouldn't really come within our materiality within overall council costs.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Mr Mayor.
I think most of the answers and question and answers have been teased out. Thank you. I'll leave mine to comment.
Okay, thank you. So we'll now look at the recommendations, and we need to have a mover for item number 3 first. So whether you want to go for option 1 or 2?
Madam Chair, I'm quite happy to move all 4 with option 1 around the Acacia Birch.
Okay. Do we have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Naylor. And is everyone happy that those 4 go together? Okay. And we're now open for comment. Councillor Bowen. Oh, Mr Mayor, you moved. I'll let you go first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, I just want to comment. This has actually been, this has been round the mulberry bush a few times. So I acknowledge the officers bringing it forward, but actually, I think we've fronted this 2 or 3 different times. So thank you for finally getting it over the line. Look, Acacia Birch has really small turnover, and the dollars involved aren't huge. But when you heard the audit fee, and this is not being anti-Audit New Zealand, they have to go through a process, but to pay $16,000, $17,000 for an audit, and you know, our annual grant to them is 50-something thousand, 60,000, is huge, and I believe it isn't, and the trust board believe it isn't required. With the performing arts, it's even worse. I'm aware they have less than a dozen bank transactions, and their biggest expense is the audit fee every year. So it really is a sledgehammer for an acorn sort of approach. I think that the audit fees, the review is required for Acacia Birch. You know, it's an organisation that's trading. There is some staff, not many, but you know, it does need all the checks and balances. And I think, as the CFO said, it comes into our consolidated accounts, so there's another wrap round and check of numbers and everything else. So I'd ask you to support this. These 2 organisations have been asking for some time on this, and I think it's now time to do the right thing. Thank you.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, supporting option 1 specifically. As the Mayor said, we've been around the mulberry bush. This, I think, came up in late 2017, early 2018. It's been quite the process to get to this point, primarily because it's complicated where our CCOs sit in terms of that reporting requirement through the council's consolidated accounts. And I'm supporting a review rather than an audit, and not supporting not doing anything, because I think it's appropriate that we keep a line of sight as to how much that review/audit actually does cost council. I wouldn't want to see it hidden away in the costs that council bears for audit, when it is a real concern for the costs of operating CCOs generally. The audit costs are a large portion of the operating costs they have to bear, and if they didn't bear it, we would. So somewhere, someone pays, and we need to know who's paying and how much they're paying so we can make good decisions about that. So I'm happy to support option 1 on that basis.
Thank you, Councillor. Mr Armstrong.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I also support the resolution. Makes a lot of sense to me. I guess the one thing I would note, though, is that often things are material by nature rather than quantum, and I think that's something that when you're thinking about your internal control framework, you should always be mindful of. And the second thing is that external reviews have their place, but it's the internal processes, controls, delegations and segregations that are more important in my mind. And when you do have staff working, dealing with the public, with cash, it's a responsibility of the organisation to protect their interests. So I do support this resolution, and I would just comment that in respect of removing a review or reducing the scope of any review, you need to be mindful of your own assurance processes when you move forward. Thanks.
Thank you. There's no further comments, so we will go to vote. And that is carried unanimously. We'll now adjourn for morning tea, so we will be back in the chamber at 10 to 11. Yes, I do. Yes. Okay, I have a quorum, so we're now going to start. So we'll now move to item number 10, the Treasury Report, 3 months ending September the 30th, and that is on page 167. So Steve, when you're ready.
Madam Chair, councillors, just a regular 3-monthly report, nothing of any great significance to draw to your attention. Apart from the fact that during the quarter we raised $30 million for debt, 10 million of that was to fund the capital works program that was going on, and the 20 million of it was to pre-fund some debt that's maturing in May next year, and it's considered appropriate to do that well in advance these days in order to give an assurance that it's available at reasonable terms. It's being invested at a rate that more than covers the cost of the borrowing in the meantime until it's required. So that's all I've got to report at the moment.
Thank you, Steve. And we will now have a question. So Mr. Armstrong.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Steve. Just on that point, the $20 million that's been drawn down and then invested in an arbitrage, could you just, how much money are we making out of that? How does that arbitrage come about? Are we taking on any risk in doing that? And how does that activity sit with the philosophy I read within our Treasury policy that we're risk managing rather than being a profit centre?
Yep. The aim is not to be a profit centre. The aim is to be raising the funds at an appropriate time to ensure that we can obtain them, because the nature of the date of the maturity is such that there's a huge amount maturing that same day through the local government funding agency, and they're trying to, I suppose, moderate the impact on the markets at the time that that's going to happen by councils pre-funding. And there's quite a high proportion of councils who've actually funded that prior to the end of June even. I personally didn't feel the need to fund it quite that early, but the advice that we have is that to fund progressively those things well in advance is important. It's certainly one of the things that Standard & Poor's or S&P Global look at now as part of their rating. They're more or less expecting that you will pre-fund those things 12 months in advance as part of the liquidity tests that they do on us. So the policy does enable us to borrow in advance, particularly for that purpose, but it's not, as I said, with the desire to try to borrow to make money out of it, if you like. That's not the aim.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. That's, I'm really happy with that answer, and it's good to hear that. The next question I had was around the $388 million of projected debt, and I just wondered around what the bookends of that potential borrowing requirement are in relation to outcomes with Three Waters or other programs. So you've taken a blended view there, I'm assuming, but what's the least amount of debt, what's the most amount of debt that you're sort of, what's the envelope of uncertainty that you're dealing with?
Well, right at this time, it's really uncertain, to be honest, and so that's why we're projecting at the relatively low end of what we expect the council's borrowing to be. If you were thinking about looking 10 years out and taking the wastewater into the program, that in itself is being talked of at the highest level of, over $700 million, and so that would mean our debt levels were much higher than what we're projecting in terms of this particular forecast for the moment. So we've been required to try to make a guess, if you like, best guess, but at the very low end in order not to be over-hedged at this point and to stick with the...
So that is the low end rather than a midpoint?
Yes, at the moment it is.
Thank you. And then my last question really relates more to the detail around the swap book and the mark-to-market, the $15 million adjustment. And I appreciate where that comes from, and the world has changed quite dramatically. But my question for you is, if you think about our policy and our current operating environment, and you look at the outcome of the hedging, and particularly the forward-dated swaps, which make up half of that negative adjustment, with the benefit of hindsight, would you change anything in the policy or do anything differently going forward?
Well, we, as you recall, had the policy amended a little while ago to put a longer-term focus into that, and to do that in conscious of where the market is now and what the expectations are for the market. So the policy is always looked forward with the knowledge that you've got at the time, trying to do the best to protect the council against upward interest rate movements. And even at the time we started engaging in those ones in 2015-16 that had 4% as sort of their level, that was about, that's what the market was saying at that point. So to be honest, you have to put the stake in the ground and say, what is it that, in terms of the policy approach? The policy approach was to try to protect against upward movements and to take advice about that. That's what we've done, and it's always, in hindsight, easy to say, well, perhaps we shouldn't have, but the reality is we chose to do that. We needed to have a policy about fixing, and we did that with the best advice we could get at the time.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
Okay, thank you. There are no more questions, so thank you, Steve. You may step down. I'm happy to move the two recommendations, seconded by Councillor Harpeta. Are there any comments? This is a straightforward report, so we'll go to vote. Councillor Johnson, you've just popped in.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Didn't leave much time between any comments, and then we'll go to vote. I just wanted to make a comment about the hedging and the policy that Mr Armstrong has brought up. As members will be aware, every time the Treasury report has come up over the past 4 years, I have questioned whether or not the percentage that was hedged was considered appropriate and whether or not it needed to be reduced. And as well as that, the Treasury policy has been reviewed regularly. So I wouldn't like the impression to be that there's been no consideration of hedging by anybody around the table. However, the response has always been, until recently, that the level of risk through hedging was the proportion that was hedged and the fixed and the portion that wasn't was considered appropriate. So I think I take the point that with the benefit of hindsight, one might consider that the hedging percentage was perhaps too high, but on the other hand, we wouldn't also like to be in the position of things going the other way. So I just wanted to make that comment because it has, Mr Armstrong probably wouldn't be aware, being relatively new to the committee, but it has been raised on a regular basis for the last at least 4 years anyway.
Thank you, Councillor, for that clarification. So we will now go to vote. And that is carried unanimously. We now move on to item number 11, which is page 177, the Mayor and Deputy Mayor expenditure. So Hannah, we'll take it as read unless you've got anything to add to it. So are there any questions, councillors? Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Hannah. On item 3, where it says that total expenditure for the 1920 year was $133,902.10. When we compare that to the actuals in the table, which come to 86,546, there's obviously a gap. Can you explain what that gap is?
Certainly, through you, Madam Chair. The table in section 3 is specifically looking at the sensitive expenditure that members itemised for us at the September meeting of this committee, whereas the total budget also includes the office expenses of the Mayor's office.
Okay, thank you. So when we've got the credit card use in item 4 and it says that there's some overlap, does that mean that the total sensitive expenditure is more than what is listed in level 3, in point 3?
What is coded in section 4 is a subset of section 3.
Okay, so all of that expenditure that's in credit card use is already accounted for in section 3 table?
That's as I understand it, yes.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the previous year, where we've got the double asterisks, it says that we haven't done a review of the prior year, but do we not have a budget for the current year? So I understand for the 18-19 that wasn't done, but is there no budget for the 19-20 year?
So, through Madam Chair, your note with the asterisks is that there's some notes in the smaller text below. What we're trying to explain there is that there is money that is set aside in the miscellaneous budget, and these particular sensitive items were miscoded there, and we've picked them up, and so we've itemised them for you. But if I was to provide you the budget, it wouldn't give you a useful comparison. So what we've noted is there's some items that have been coded to miscellaneous, which should not have been, which we're showing you, and that's why we've noted that in the next steps.
I see, and the budget is just for miscellaneous in total?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Hannah. Just a couple of questions. The table on page 178 that's being referred to, a number of the items, hospitality and travel and accommodation, are there twice. So they're there in the top part, and then they're also there under the miscellaneous. And so I'm just wondering why those items, is there any difference between the top one and the bottom one, or why are those not just combined to show the total for those items?
A similar question to Councillor Johnson. We could have combined them to be able to explain to you the entire picture. We wanted to show you that we have separate budget codes, and there were some sensitive items that had been put in a different budget code, which we're also providing to you. So we're just showing you that everything rather than combining it.
Okay, so there's no real difference between the activities between those. No. Okay, thank you. And just the second question relates to the decision process for approving budget if the full budget has already been spent. So I guess specifically, for example, in the other grants and donations, for example, where there's obviously some decision making around that, but and particularly looking at the amount that was spent in the previous year as well in excess of the budget. And I'm just wondering, is there a decision-making process of needing to be approved by more than just the Mayor or Deputy Mayor, or is it simply down to the discretion of the Mayor or Deputy Mayor for those decisions?
So those are discretionary items, and you'll note, as is also noted in the background to the paper, that subsequent to the expenses being made, they are viewed by the chair of this committee, or indeed the external member of this committee, and that's the process we follow.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any further questions, councillors? Thank you, Hannah. You may step down. So we'll go to the recommendation. I am happy to move the recommendation. Seconder, Councillor Rutherford. Are there any comments? Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just comment that it's good that these expenses are now coming to this committee, and I think once we get a little bit of a history of the years of them, we might be able to make more conclusions from them. But in any case, I look forward to the 2021 spend being significantly less, as I'm sure the Mayor's office will be tightening its belt along with everybody else.
Thank you, Councillor. There are no more comments, so we will go to vote. And that is carried 13 votes for and 1 abstention. We now move on to item number 12, which is Otira Park lease. That's on page 186. And we have Kathy and Bryce. So we'll take it that that report is read unless you want to add any other additional information.
No, the only thing, pardon me, councillors, is that the resolution we're asking for today is a resolution that we need as a procedural matter under the Reserves Act in order to enter into a lease. So the council must resolve to go to public notification of a lease before we can start to progress towards putting a lease in place, and that's the main purpose of this report.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions, councillors? Councillor Barrett.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Kathy and Bryce. Was actually quite interested to realise that this was public land, because I've been in that space a number of times and seen people enjoying time with their horses there, and just wondered if in the process of renewing the lease, etc., there might be scope to, I guess, identify it as public land and make it clear that there is a club that is using public land, and that if other members of the public wanted to either contact the club or contact the council, there might be a way to do that. It just, because quite honestly, 20 years of going back and forth by there, I had assumed that it was just sort of private grazing for animals, and if we're genuinely using public resource for that, it would be nice for the public to be able to easily realise that.
A part of the process of publicly notifying the intention into a lease, I think, will increase awareness of the fact that it is public land. It is on all our maps as Otira Park and as public land, but certainly as part of the lease and moving forward, if a decision was made to lease it to the Pony Club, we could put some signage there that reflects that. Obviously, there is a conflict between horses and members of the public, so the Pony Club would not want to see that land publicly accessible, but due to the welfare of the horses.
That's great,
Are
thank
there
you.
any further questions, councillors? Have you pushed your button? Oh, okay. Councillor Harpeter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Kathy and Bryce. How are we going to, I was looking in your paper to see how we were going to publicly notify, and just knowing that we have a little bit of issues about consultation, particularly around issues. So wondering how we were going to publicly notify, and whether or not, whether you would do any kind of consultation a different way with this community, because we have had issues around this.
So it's a little bit like the Resource Management Act. The Act sets out what we must do, which is public notification in a daily newspaper of the area in which the lease is proposed to be installed. But we would also intend to do targeted stakeholder consultation, which is what we did with Rangatane Park recently with Men's Shed, which was all those properties that were adjacent to the area. We would also do targeted consultation with the likes of Sport Manawatu and obviously our partner in Rangatane, because the marae backs onto this area. So that's the nature of the general consultation that we would have proposed under this process.
So would we look at doing letterbox drops or anything like that, a little bit further than just targeted, like go further than that?
Councillors, the consultation process intended would be letter drop to the local residents. Any letter drop, the cost of producing those letters and the cost of dropping those off, is a cost that is unbudgeted. So if councillors were of a mind to want us to extend that wider, then you'll need to signal that. But the intention at the moment is the immediate neighbours and those key stakeholders that have an interest in this reserve.
Thank you.
Okay. Any further questions, councillors? No? Okay. Thank you both. There are 3 recommendations. I'm on your page. I'm happy to take the 3 together unless anybody somebody like to move them. Councillor Rutherford, seconded by Councillor Naylor. Are there any comments? There being no comments, we will vote. And that is carried 13 votes for with 1 abstention. We now move on to item 13 on page 209, and that's the Ashes Domain proposal to lease area for Scout Hall. And Kathy in the seat again. And again, we'll take it as read unless there's anything you want to add.
Just if I can ask Aaron to join me at the table to answer any questions.
Yes, that's fine, Aaron.
The main difference with this report, councillors, is this is a new proposal, whereas the previous one was an existing use. As such, being a new proposal, whilst the Scouts have done some local consultation with interest groups, there hasn't been any community views at this stage, wider community views sought on this proposal.
Okay, thank you. First up with questions, Councillor Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Kathy. Just a couple of questions. Just with the proposal, I noticed there was no mention of like the SEPTED principles, which come through almost every other new build or activity that we're putting, particularly on reserves. And so I'm just interested in your comments around that, because there are comments around minor pruning or some vegetation removal, but the description under 9.1.1 still talks about how there'd be minor aesthetic impacts and the building would be situated behind shelter belt trees.
So at the moment the proposal is to lease the land area. There's still a building consent process and there's still a resource consent process to go through. So the design and the location of the building itself and the function of the building would come up during those processes.
Okay, so when, obviously in the report it talks about that there were numerous locations considered before recommending this one. Was the visibility considered as a measure, or was that given any weight to the areas that were looked at?
I'll ask Aaron to answer that, since he was involved in that part of the process.
Through you, Madam Chair, yes, the safety and security of the building was part of the conversation with the Scouts. We looked at 10 to 12 sites, I think the number right in front of me, throughout Ashurst, and we used a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats of each site to kind of consider how they might stack up. Ultimately, and when the Scouts suggested that this was their preferred location, we noted that it wasn't as visible as some of the other sites, but they were comfortable with that risk. When we consulted the grazing leaseholder in particular, he made note of some of the vandalism that occurs in his leasehold area, which this borders or is part of, and that was highlighted to the Scouts, but they were comfortable that this location was their preference, despite those slight misgivings or concerns.
Just a final question, is all of the conversations between the Scouts and the community to date have indicated that they were looking to build on the pit? I don't know what the formal name for it is. Do you know the space I'm talking about? Yes, okay. And so that included some quite detailed drawings that they have been circulating, and I'm just wondering where the change of location came from, and I guess what had been permitted in regards to that site originally.
So the site is the Works Pit, so you've pretty well got the name right there. So there are many issues associated with that site. One of the issues is the topography of the site, and when we started initial discussions with Scouts, while that was their preferred location, it became quite difficult to work through those issues. Also, building on that site, it was a works pit, so it is potentially contaminated site, and so there were a number of barriers. But probably one of the big things there was getting on or off the highway. So we had discussions around the traffic movements, and if you can imagine people turning right into there, and what traffic congestion that would cause for other people moving on along that section of what is highway at the moment. So there were a number of things around that made that site quite difficult to manage and to go forward with.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam
Thank you. Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just referring to paragraphs 5.4, 5.5, which talks about sustainable practices, and then also the building would contain a combination of open plan activity space, meeting rooms, storage, and kitchen. That takes care of grey water, but what's in the plan around wastewater? Thank you.
So the sewer line is right there. We're actually just doing a sewer line upgrade from the camping ground into the sewage system. So the intention would be that grey water would go into the sewage system.
Yes, so just for clarity, so that is actually formally in the proposal from the Scouts?
That would be a requirement under their building consent due to the sensitivity of the environment there, that they would have to connect up to the main sewer.
Thank you, Kathy. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Kathy and Aaron. At figure 4 shows the proposal for retaining the existing car park capacity, and it shows needing to relocate a fence, and there's some commentary about a small reduction in the area of land that's available to be grazed, obviously, as a result. So have you sort of factored in how much that would cost? In other words, the cost of relocating the fence, anything that might need to be done to that piece of land, and presumably the reduction in the cost of the lease. Have we got some figures around that?
Councillor, I don't have any figures at hand, but it is a simple farm fence to be relocated. The assumption was that would be part of the requirement for the Scouts to lease the site, that they would need to relocate that farm fence, and whether they did that through volunteer efforts or paying a fencer to do could be done. In terms of the land itself, there wasn't any proposal to install any drainage or anything. The soils there are recently looking at, Kathy is much more horticulturally knowledgeable than myself, but I understand the soil is quite free draining. The car park is, overflow car park is only used irregularly, and you can see from the figure that there's an area that is maintained slightly differently for the overflow car park compared to the grazed area. That area would be essentially remain the same because the Scouts would be maintaining the area within their leased area, so we're just shifting our maintenance across.
And would we expect there to be a reduction in income from the leased land since it's now a smaller area?
I would assume, sorry.
Yeah, the area in question is a very small proportion of the overall grazed area, so I don't imagine there would be any impact. The grazing leases are market related anyway, so they do get reviewed, and so that would probably pick up any difference that may occur.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is regarding this Scouts group, and I'm sorry if I've missed it through the report. Is there any history of this group, and how many people we are talking about? How big is the group who wants to use this facility?
I'll ask Aaron to answer that. Councillors, this group has been before you in the previous council term. They came and made a submission on their proposal, and this is where this has come from, and we went away with that submission, but I'm not sure if Aaron's got up-to-date figures.
Unfortunately, no, I don't have up-to-date figures. I could go away and get those and reply to them. They did have a scout hall, and
Rutherford may correct me if I have this wrong. My understanding is they did have a scout call quite close to the school, which was sold off, I believe, about 10 years ago, and the scouts have reinvigorated themselves and have new management, and they'd like to pursue re-establishing a new hall in the community. But I don't have, I'm sorry, Councillor, I don't have the numbers, so I'll bring those back to you.
Thank you. Just one more question regarding this finances or expenditure on public notification. Is there a difference between modest cost and minor cost? Because the previous notice says the same kind of notification will cost us minor, and this one is costing us modest.
That's probably something that I, as editing Aaron's report, should have picked up, that difference, but we wouldn't expect there to be any actual physical difference between those costs.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Denison. Okay, thank you. Just a question from me. Just to clarify, are there any council costs associated with this proposal?
Other than officer time, obviously, as you can appreciate, any time a proposal comes forward, even to bring a report to council and to give consideration and to meet with the applicant is quite a bit of time. And so going forward, we will be there to assist the applicant to go through the building consenting process and through the resource consent process, as well as the consultation. But physical costs on the ground, our expectation is all of those would be met by scouts as part of their lease conditions.
Okay, and in part of the lease conditions, have we put any clause on to stop, like what's happened in the past where we've got these unwieldy buildings that aren't being used, just sitting? We've got a couple of scout halls in Palmerston that are now not being used, and they're eyesores, and the scouts haven't got the money to do them up. So how do we prevent, how do we keep the building maintained so that it of a high standard?
So there are standard lease conditions in the lease that's attached to this report that outlines about keeping the building well maintained, and there is a dispute resolution clauses in there, and the ability also for council to make reparation and to seek that money back from the group. At the end of the day, though, I think as you move through with these, you look at each of the bodies that you're leasing to and their ability to consider the ongoing costs. And certainly when this group first approached council, they had put together a business case and consideration to how they were going to fundraise for this. The decision we're asking for today is really just about the land piece and the leasing of that. Obviously, they've got to get through the funding and the building consent and the resource consent processes yet.
Okay, thank you. There are no further questions, so you may step down. Right, we'll look at, there's 3 recommendations there. Is anyone happy to move them? Thank you, Councillor Barrett, seconded by Councillor Rutherford. Is there any comment? Councillor Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm happy to support this proposal. For those who do recall the presentation from the Scouts group, they are a growing group in the region, and they do have members who travel to attend their functions, their get-togethers, and in particular they did talk about the fact that some of their regional meetings would see people coming over from Wanganui and further afield as well to attend some of the more, I think, annual 6-monthly events that they run. And the other thing that they did present us with when they came was quite a clear fundraising plan. So they have got, they've got money in the bank already, and they do have a really clear plan. And then I guess just on the consultation side, this won't be a surprise to the Ashurst community. The location will be. It's something that the community haven't seen, but the Scouts have been at community markets. They had an open day. They set themselves up outside the library and did put a bouncy castle and a sausage sizzle on, and talked about the fact that they wanted to build a facility in Ashurst. So that was probably just before Christmas, and then there has been some reasonable ongoing communication through the Village Voice in Ashurst keeping people in the loop, that their plans are still ongoing and in the works. So they have really brought the community along with them, and I think that there'd be a reasonable amount of support for this as well.
Thank you, Councillor. There are no further comments, so we will move to vote. And that is carried unanimously. We'll now move to item number 14, which is the committee work schedule. And I'd just like to highlight item number 4, which I have a recommendation put up for that. And that is that the Chief Executive be instructed to report back to the October meeting. That was from the recommendation, and that this report is no longer required. So this was, if you refer back to Whakaronga and the public housing report, this was from a recommendation from our financials and that from that report, and that was moved by Councillor Barrett. And because there is no recommendations to do with the Whakaronga housing, this report is no longer required. So I'm happy to move it, and Councillor Barrett is going to second it. Is there any questions on this or any other part of the work schedule? Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just a further item that I think should be included in the work schedule is the elected member expense policy, which at the last meeting was referred to a workshop. But I believe that any decisions that need to be made around that policy will need to come back to the meeting, so I think that should remain on the work schedule.
Yep, that's fine. Councillor Dennison.
I just picked up that same point out of the minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Just regarding item 4 to be removed, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought we hadn't actually made a decision for or against public housing at Whakaronga, and therefore it seems to me a little bit premature to take this out.
We haven't made the decision, but it's a bit of the cart before the horse, because the report was directed for October, which is now, and because we haven't made a decision, the report couldn't be written, so we're revoking it, and then if at a later date, if a recommendation comes for Whakaronga, then we can add the report. And perhaps if Councillor Barrett, you were the one that put that forward, you're comfortable with that?
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, if there's no more questions, I'll move the work schedule plus the new recommendation. And are you happy to second the work schedule, Councillor Barrett? And we'll both vote on both if everybody's happy with that. Okay, we'll move to vote on both. And that is carried unanimously. We're now getting onto our final item. So on item number 15, that the public be excluded from the following parts of the proceedings, and that's for item number 16 to do with the Bunnythorpe Community Facility expansion because of negotiations. I'm happy to move that. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Dennison, is there any comments? No, I'll take the vote. And that is carried unanimously. And, yep. So we'll have 5 minutes just to, and before we go into item 16, yep, there is an additional information for item 16, so I'll hand that out now, and then I'll get